quickly. Settle down.
(1903), an important year for the fledgling world of flight. On the morning of December 17th, a dream as old as history was fulfilled as man conquered the air. The world's first powered flight machine, the Flyer, was airborne for 12 seconds and covered 120 feet. The Wright brothers opened new doors to endless possibilities when their Flyer made the unthinkable a reality. As with anything new and different, there was no shortage of skeptics. It was up to those visionaries who saw the potential of the flying machine to convince others. One of flight's most dedicated visionaries was James H. Jimmy Doolittle. As airplanes were breaking new ground in 1917, Doolittle enlisted in the aviation section of the U.S. Army Signal Corps, but the lieutenant never saw combat and spent World War I as a flight instructor. Among the minuscule 4% of pilots retained after the war, he quickly earned the reputation as a reckless young daredevil. But for Doolittle, there was an underlying purpose to what often appeared to be nothing more than aerial hijinks. He was, in fact, methodically satisfying an inborn curiosity concerning what both he and the airplane were capable of doing. Although stunts were just one means of defining those limits, Doolittle, throughout his flying career, would always very carefully weigh the consequences every time he climbed into a plane. These qualities, in addition to his extraordinary flying skills, kept him alive and made him well suited for his post-war career as a test pilot, where he would set and break numerous records. Breaking records not only satisfied a personal need to overcome challenges, but generated publicity for air power's potential as well.
I flew from Pablo Beach, Florida, near Jacksonville, to San Diego, California, a distance of about 2,200 miles in 22 hours and 20 minutes. In 1931, I flew from Los Angeles, California, to New York in 11 hours and 15 minutes. That first flight was the first time that the continent had ever been crossed in less than one day. Second flight was the first time it had ever been crossed in less than half a day.
In 1925, Doolittle was in Baltimore, Maryland, to fly the elegant Curtiss Racer against some of the world's finest pilots in the prestigious Schneider Seaplane Trophy Race. Having painstakingly devised an innovative technique for approaching and turning the pylons by diving into his turns, Doolittle completely obliterated the world seaplane speed record by flying at an average speed of 232 miles per hour, outpacing his nearest rival by more than 33 miles per hour. The thrill that came with such victories was gratifying, to be sure, but for Doolittle, these races had a purpose beyond personal glory.
These record flights have a very real meaning. Competition has perhaps always been the greatest stimulus to improvement. And out of this competition came improvements that were improvements in the performance of aircraft and the safety of aircraft, and those improvements were immediately applicable to the military and indirectly applicable to commercial aviation.
Under the surface of his sometimes flamboyant public image, Doolittle was at heart always a dedicated flight researcher, a man trying to bridge the intellectual gap between theory and practice, between the arcane calculations of the aeronautical engineer and the everyday realities of the pilot. In 1924, during a series of extremely hazardous test flights, Doolittle pushed himself and his craft to the limits. These tests led to the first genuinely scientific measurements of the full effects of acceleration on an aircraft and its pilot. Doolittle, with himself as guinea pig, analyzed and reported on the little-understood phenomenon of pilot blackout. Flying a Curtiss Hawk in 1927, He once again pushed his own endurance to the limit as he successfully performed the first outside loop in history. This would be only the first of many firsts during Doolittle's career. Having earned one of the first American doctorates in aeronautical science at MIT in 1925, Doolittle continued to ply his trade as chief test pilot at Wright Field, and in 1928 he was chosen to manage the full flight laboratory. This endeavor, dedicated to studying the problems of flight in adverse weather conditions, was financed by the Guggenheim Foundation. In September of 1929, after months of painstaking preparation, Doolittle made what he later considered one of the most important flights of his career.
First completely blind flight. Taking off under a hood, flying a prescribed course, and landing back under the hood without ever having seen out of the airplane. This doesn't sound very important now, but out of that came two instruments, the artificial horizon, the directional gyro, that are today standard equipment on every commercial airplane and every combat military airplane.
This flight was indeed a major milestone in aviation's progress, marking the beginning of the end of the so-called seat of the pants era of flying. Such progress hadn't been without risk. Doolittle had once been forced to bail out from a stricken craft that was just 500 feet above the ground. It also took a toll on his military career. A doctor of science and national hero, by 1930, Jimmy Doolittle was still just a lowly lieutenant in the peacetime Air Corps. Reluctantly resigning his commission, he went to work for Shell Oil as the manager of its various aviation endeavors. Leaving the Air Corps, however, did not mean leaving the cockpit. In 1931, a streamlined biplane, the Laird Super Solution, was designed specifically for him to fly in the first Bendix race. Taking off from Burbank, California, he sped cross-country to Albuquerque, where he stopped to refuel. Touching down again to refuel in Kansas City, he streaked onward to Cleveland, crossing the finish line a full hour ahead of his closest competitor. On this remarkable day, however, he wasn't done yet. Within minutes, he was off again, this time destined for Newark, New Jersey. It was on this memorable flight that he became the first man ever to span the continent in less than half a day. And as if that wasn't enough, after touching down in Newark, he turned right around and raced back to Cleveland. Finally, after 15 grueling hours in a cramped cockpit, he was happily reunited with his wife, Jo, and eldest son, Jim Jr. The following year, Doolittle hoped to fly a modified version of the Super Solution in the national air races at Cleveland, but a crash landing dashed those hopes until another craft, the radical GBR-1, was offered as a replacement. Capable of speeds in excess of 300 miles per hour, the barrel-shaped GB racers were without a doubt the fastest aircraft in the skies. Unfortunately, they were also among the deadliest. Wickedly unstable and unforgiving, they would ultimately kill most of the pilots who dared to fly them. Doolittle himself would later look back on the GB as the touchiest airplane he had ever flown. Flying it, he said, was a bit like balancing a pencil on the tip of your finger. But fly it he did, mastering the treacherous little craft, speeding his way to a new world speed mark of 296 miles per hour during the qualifying runs. He went on to win the most prestigious of air races, the Thompson Trophy race. Averaging more than 10 miles per hour faster than his nearest competitor, before 50,000 wildly cheering spectators, this victory was the high point of Jimmy Doolittle's racing career. Ironically, it was also his farewell to competitive flying. He had fulfilled all of his racing ambitions, and the sport of air racing had, in his view, served its legitimate purpose. Besides, he explained to the press, he had yet to hear of anyone engaged in the sport dying of old age. Although he had removed himself from the national limelight, Jimmy Doolittle went on to make some of his most important contributions to the future of American air power. In the early 30s, the Army Air Corps was struggling to maintain itself while it tried to establish the then novel idea that the critical importance of air power in future combat would make it essential that a separate organization, an independent air force, should be established. In 1934, Doolittle was appointed to the Baker Board, a presidentially mandated commission chartered to plot the future course of American military aviation. Often he found himself alone as the single dissenting opinion. A solitary voice, however, which would prove to be extraordinarily prophetic. Several trips to Europe in the late 30s convinced him that there were perilous times ahead. Volunteering to return to active duty, Doolittle rejoined the Air Corps in July of 1940. He was a 45-year-old lieutenant colonel when the United States endured the most humiliating defeat in its history, Pearl Harbor. Just 3 months later, under Doolittle's command, a group of hand-selected volunteer pilots began training at Eglin Field in Florida. The pilots weren't privy to every detail of their mission. All they knew was that they were expected to get a fully loaded B-25 Mitchell medium bomber off the ground in less than 500 feet. On April 2nd, 1942, the aircraft carrier USS Hornet set sail for the Pacific. On board, Doolittle's raiders were informed of their mission: to proceed to a point 450 miles east of Japan and do what had never been done before: launch a 14-ton medium-sized bomber from a carrier. If all went as planned, they would drop their bombs on Tokyo and then proceed to landing fields in China. While en route to their launch point, the 80 pilots were briefed daily on the details of their missions. They tried to keep in shape and conducted mock ceremonies, wiring Japanese metals to 500-pound bombs so that they could be returned to their owners with interest. All of the careful planning, however, went awry in the early morning hours of April 18th. Still 200 miles from their designated launch point, the carrier task force spotted a pair of Japanese patrol vessels. The ships were destroyed, but the question remained: had they reported sighting the Americans? Admiral Halsey, the task force commander, couldn't risk jeopardizing his carriers by proceeding further into Japanese waters. After conferring with Doolittle, the order was issued to launch the bombers immediately. This meant that Doolittle and his B-25s would have to fly an extra 250 miles to reach their destination. Even fully loaded with fuel, their chances of safely reaching China would be something less than slim. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle's lead aircraft stood poised on the pitching deck with the rest of the B-25s behind him, the last one hanging precariously over the edge. With 100 feet to spare, Doolittle became the first pilot ever to fly a medium-sized bomber from the deck of a carrier. Crewmen cheered as one plane after another filled the sky and the raiders embarked on their mission. Because of wretched weather and a lack of fuel, none of the B-25s were able to make it to landing fields in China. And in the immediate aftermath of the raid, with his crews scattered and their aircraft lost, Doolittle was convinced that his mission had been an abysmal failure. He was wrong. The military effect of the raid was minimal. Although the physical damage was repaired in just a few days, the Japanese had gotten their first taste of war on their own soil, and it rattled them. In China, Doolittle and his surviving raiders were honored by the Chinese government, and when they returned stateside, they were given a hero's welcome. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor and promoted to the rank of Brigadier General. With his new promotion to Brigadier General, Doolittle's first major assignment was to command the 12th Air Force preparing for Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. His primary job was to prevent Axis supplies, personnel, and material from getting into Tunisia, and then to prevent enemy troops from getting out. His forces carried out their mission with devastating effect. As the campaign drew to a close in April of 1943, now Major General Doolittle placed it in perspective.
The Battle of Tunisia is over. It was a hard fight, but it represented only the initial phase of this operation. It was a preliminary bout. The main event will be the all-out air operation against Germany and against Berlin itself.
During the North African campaign, Doolittle earned the nickname the Flying General. He made it a point to fly frequent combat missions with his units so that he could fully understand the pressures under which they operated. In January of 1944, Doolittle, now a lieutenant general, was placed in command of the mighty 8th Air Force, a massive aerial juggernaut that was then taking the war to the heartland of Hitler's Germany. Initially, bomber losses were prodigious. The practice at the time was for the bombers to fly over their targets, release their bombs, and then get the hell out as fast as they could. Damaged airplanes that couldn't keep up with the formation were left behind for the Luftwaffe fighters to finish off. Shortly after assuming command, General Doolittle issued a controversial order directing that the speed of all formations should be reduced so that the slowest craft could keep up. Bomber crews were to maintain extremely tight formations at those speeds so that the massed firepower of the entire formation could be used to protect the damaged aircraft. Despite the fact that the bomber crews objected strenuously, Doolittle's innovation ultimately saved a good many of their lives. And while this decision may have been unpopular with the flyers, they were absolutely outraged by a subsequent Doolittle directive. In the spring of 1944, it was imperative that the Allies achieve air superiority over Western Europe in preparation for the upcoming Normandy invasion. Until that time, the mission of the 8th Air Force fighters had been to provide escort for the heavy bombers. In yet another calculated risk, Doolittle told his fighter commanders, from now on, your mission is to destroy the German Air Force. This momentous decision took extraordinary moral courage, for in turning the fighters loose, Doolittle was not only risking his own career, he was seemingly putting the lives of thousands of the bomber crews in jeopardy. Having been considered both a hero and a visionary, he now found himself labeled as a murderer of young men. Undaunted, Doolittle believed that by wielding his fighters against the Luftwaffe in the air or on the ground, the bombers would ultimately benefit. Throughout the early months of 1944, the 8th's fighter groups went on a rampage in the skies over Western Europe, unleashing their fury against the Nazi fighters, blowing them out of the skies and decimating them on the ground. Doolittle's calculated gamble, which he later regarded as his most important military decision, paid off handsomely. When D-Day finally arrived, he flew over the beaches of Normandy, and during an hour-long flight, he didn't spot a single German aircraft. Air superiority had been won, and in the months that followed, Doolittle's 8th Air Force helped pound the Axis into submission and finally surrender. Although he retired from active duty in 1946, Doolittle never became inactive, and he never lost his sense of duty. Not a man to rest on his laurels, Jimmy Doolittle's so-called retirement years were filled with activity and achievement. To millions of Americans, he was Mr. Aviation, and no one else in post-war America could speak so convincingly on behalf of air power. After the war, he was instrumental in the formation of the Air Research and Development Command, the forerunner of today's Air Force Systems Command. And though a civilian, He continued to serve as a troubleshooter for the newly established United States Air Force, at last a reality. He would eventually go on to serve as the chairman of the Air Force's Scientific Advisory Board during the critical period when the country was taking its first tentative steps toward the new frontier of space. He also served as the last chairman of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which was in the process of transforming itself into NASA. Approaching age 65, the one-time daredevil test pilot ended his flying career in 1961. Although Doolittle was finally out of the cockpit, he never lost his love of flying. He was frequently a keenly interested visitor to Edwards Air Force Base, where aviation continued to meet its future and where he could renew his relationship with test pilots, a breed of men with whom he shared a deep and abiding kinship. General Hap Arnold once observed that Jimmy seems never to have been absent when something big was happening in air power. Indeed, his life spanned the history of aviation. It was a remarkable life which intertwined with many of the remarkable events of that history. A remarkable life. A remarkable man. A hero. General James H. Doolittle.